welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and I'd like to welcome you to another discussion, a continuation of the last week's show, in which I tried to talk about the concept of white privilege in relationship to how it affects our day-to-day life. I started by showing Ebony magazine special edition going back into 1965 that dealt with this issue in the opening of the previous show. And I ended up talking about the Matrix. So if you want to see that, I hope you take a look at part one of this talk. Now, for those of you who are new to this show, the Umoja Circle is a African-centered talk show whose purpose is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where you will find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as as people of African descent, as black people. And I try to dedicate this show to speak from our perspective, our paradigm, our set of understanding the world. Because a lot of times when we have discussions, especially dealing with race, we tend to get a outside view, people, nothing wrong with other people talking about it and giving their perspective, but the perspective of people of the dominant group, which is, I'm talking about white America. One of the things that I found in my research and study is that there's such a thing that many people don't understand when it comes to the functioning of a culture. And what is that all about? In fact, going back maybe hundreds of years, there's such a thing that's called cultural imperialism, where a dominant group, say, who is the hegemony or the person, the group that dominates a society, their culture permeates every aspect of that society. And and there might be other groups and other cultures that part of that society, but it gets subsumed by the dominant group's culture, and if they're the power in that society, like white Europeans were in America from the beginning of this country, and how it affected people that look like me and people who look like Native American brothers and sisters, our Native Americans, some of them who look like me, because we've joined together in many aspects to survive this onslaught of the hegemony of Europe when it came over and started coming out of that continent and spreading across the Atlantic and, in some parts of Africa during the 17th and 18th and 19th and early 20th century. They dominated and became the hegemony. And their cultural and worldview became the foundations of this country, okay? Even though there were millions of people who existed who had a culture and great empires. But if you would talk to any average American, they would not even think when you're talking about, powerful American culture, they would think about this European-based culture. And that is what, in some social settings and some historians would call cultural imperialism. It's a form of warfare in a sense. You use your culture to permeate and shape the way, because the culture shapes the way a people think. And I got a definition of cultural imperialism up there on the screen. And you can see, is a set of ideas, concepts, and agencies used to structure the behavior of a people into what is required to bring a harmonious, stable, and prosperous society in accordance with the will of those in power. That's the key thing, those in power. Therefore, cultural imperialism is the standards that were set by those who tried to control people of African descent for centuries, white America, white Europeans, through deliberately created social structures, slavery, Jim Crow segregation, you know, so those powers could shape us into a new cultural identity based on the way they wanted us to live in this country as a subordinate and enslaved people. So that's how we related to America for hundreds of years. It's only been, what, since the Civil Rights Act of 1964? What, 55 years compared to almost over 300 years from 1619 to 1865, you had enslavement, okay? All right, legal enslavement, okay? Cultural imperialism was the dominant group's writing of the laws, telling us where we could go, where we could eat. We had no power in the society that was not dominated by white people. Okay, then from 1865 to 1965, you had another form of control called Jim Crow segregation. And any little gains that we made during Reconstruction after the Civil War, where our side won, but the people that betrayed this country, you know, the Confederacy, by 1877, white Northerners and those who, in their turn, were tired of dealing with the black thing, you know, that they were dealing with, you know, in the previous, earliest part of the 1800s, you know, they made a compromise in which they would take black troops out of the South, and they left us to the same Southern slaveholders, even though they were supposed to have lost the Civil War. But we had to pay the price. And we had another 100 years of Jim Crow segregation and control. You're gonna have a totally different paradigm about what is freedom in America when you live under those conditions of control. You see, the actions of a generation becomes the experience of that generation. And that experience then becomes the history of the next generation. And the history of following generations conditioned to act a certain way then become the culture of a people. And if that culture was established by the dominant group to control the movement, the lives of black, brown, red people, to be the hegemony, the dominant power, that goes against and we're still struggling with that, becomes part of the culture of white America. That's what the definition of white privilege means. When you hear a brother or sisters talk about white privilege, we're not talking about your social economic status. We know there's poor white males and females in this country. That's the shame of it, that people who are in the same economic class, black, brown, no matter what color, are, instead of working together to deal with that issue as a group, we're separated by that white elephant a lot of times called race. A lot of people, especially a lot of white Americans, have fallen victim to the racism in their own right, because they're looking at they've been conditioned by those in the higher class or the upper class, that 1% who control, and they are saying it's those brown and black people that are causing your problem, instead of them having to be looked at as the ultimate cause. It's always been the rich manipulating, especially poor whites. You know, it was poor whites who died on those battlefields around Richmond and Tennessee and Gettysburg and all those Civil War battlefield that we walk through today, and the horrors of almost 700,000 men and women died during that horrendous 4 years of conflict. It was started by the same 1% who are shaping the policies that benefit them, but they're using the poor whites to blame the people who is marginalized forever. Black, brown, yellow, or certain religious groups. The same strategies working to this day in the 21st century. I talked a little bit about culture and the cultural myth in the last show. Culture is a powerful tool. That's why I put up that discussion about cultural imperialism. It's sort of like, let me just say, there was when you hear people of African descent complain about racism, and we talk about white America, there is always this kind of outrage that a lot of white Americans take personally, because they have been conditioned. You have been conditioned to believe that when we talk about racist, we always look at that Southern sheriff, who's a sheriff by day and a card-carrying Ku Klux Klansman at night. And of course, a lot of white Americans, especially even liberal whites, will say, well, that's not me. So when you call me a racist, no, it's not about racism. Racism is not an individual thing. It's not individual acts. It's a system, okay? It was a system that was created at the beginning of this country. It was a system that was created by laws. And laws are things that shape how you think. That's the experiences I talked about when I said the experience, the actions of a people, the actions of creating certain laws that gave white males power at the first Continental Congress, the first Constitutional Congress after the ratification of the Constitution in 1789, all right? The laws did not give black people power or Native Americans power. It gave white males power, okay? And only white males. And only white males who had property. And then the Constitution made it so that if you struggle with your interest group, you would be able to get whatever power through the political system, as you organize. And it's messy, and it is a struggle. Black people were organizing even back then in the late 1700s, early 1800s. All through the 1800s, black people were organized, but that history is seldom talked about. It was always a struggle. That's the way this system was established. Your interest group would vie against other interest groups, white males, white landowners, female suffragettes. Native people even tried to get into the struggle. So it's always been this constant, and it's still that way to this very day. That's how this democracy, this democratic republic is supposed to work. But this cultural myth that I talked about in the previous show tells people, white people, that somehow they are special, okay? That somehow just because of this mythology that they gained this, they pulled themselves by their own bootstrap. No, that is a myth. The reason that many white people have land in America is because the government gave them. There were land grants in the 1860s, okay? Oklahoma Sooners, football and basketball team is named after the Sooners who, that's why they have that wagon running around the field during the football game. It was because of a land grant that was given to the Oklahoma, in the Oklahoma territories, mostly only for white who could stake out land. State colleges came out in the 1860s, so that, you can teach white males how to prosper using their land with agricultural techniques. It wasn't just, things that were done by each individual. It was a system that was established by law. And if you were white and you were male, you got the upper hand, all right? So that is how a lot of legacies, you were allowed into, certain colleges, like I said. Anything that has state, North Carolina State, South Carolina State, these were government granted institutions. So you did not get this thing just by your individual self. It was given to you by a system that put a particular group of people above another group. That's how it works. There's a thing that many people might not be familiar with. It's called unconscious bias. I want to talk about that next before I end this program, to show you that many of us are affected unconsciously by racism. Whether you're black or white Americans, we all are, okay? Again, your culture affects how you think, and the systems within that culture reinforce that thinking unconsciously. There was experiments that were done to prove that racism is buried unconsciously in the majority of America, especially white America. If you think that you are not racist, the fact that you're saying that is a problem, because when you say that, then you don't have to do anything. That's that white privilege that I said earlier in the previous show, where you have that privilege of not having to think about it. But if you don't think about it and you go about your life and that system continues to move on decade after decade, you have that privilege of oblivion to the situation. You're not helping the situation. You're just reinforcing it by allowing it to continue. And when a situation like what you might see on a video clip about some kind of racial actions, or some obviously racist police actions against a black community or a brown community or Native Americans about their land and what have you, you can look at it from a distance instead of not understanding that that's part of the problem. The system that is creating those things, if you don't participate in it as an American citizen, then don't complain about why these things are happening. They're happening because they're part of a system, and the system is not going to change unless you dedicate yourself or make sure your children understand to change it. And it is certain practices that you have to do. You can't do that when you're oblivious to it. There was a Gallup poll done to show that we have no difference between yesterday and today. Back in 1963, the Gallup organization asked white Americans, again, if they believed that people of color or black people in America or in their neighborhoods were getting fair housing, fair education, fair job applicants being fairly treated in job, and 2 out of 3 white Americans said, yeah, sure. Now this is 1963. In 1963, you had the bombing that killed those young black girls. You had the Children's March, where you were seeing children hosed down by Bull Connors and his group, city service fire department, all right? You had Medgar Evers being shot in Jackson, Mississippi. You had, the governor of Alabama standing in front of the entrance of the University of Alabama. And now, there was not the 500 stations that we have today and video games and all these things to distract you. People in 1963 and in 1962 and 1961, we would look back and say, yeah, racism did exist from our perch, 50-something years later, almost 60 years later. But whiter people in that time, their present, our past, looked at Gallup surveyor and said, yes, I believe. 2 out of 3 said, I believe that, yes, black people are being fair equity. Now they're looking at the same news, Walter Cronkite in CBS News and ABC and NBC. That's only 3 stations, basically, national stations that were around. And they showed all those racist events that I'm talking to, day in, day out. On top of, later on showing, Vietnam and all that. But the civil rights movement going on in the early 60s, and this was before the March on Washington in 1963, when this Gallup survey was done. Yet white Americans were claiming oblivion to the racist problem in the midst of all that. And we got this more subtle racism that exists, that is really no different. And we're still having a large portion of white America wondering why Black Lives Matter, or what you're talking about, police brutality, or y'all taking our jobs. Even though the unemployment rate is higher in black communities and brown communities than in white communities. You see? So this oblivion is still existent. This obliviousness to racism. I mean, it kind of reminds me of that movie, The Matrix. And that's a good metaphor for how white and black and brown people look at their reality. Keanu Reeves' character and the Lawrence Fishburne character told that Keanu Reeves character, if you want to wake up from your dream, take the red pill, okay? Everybody else is walking around with the blue pill, or whatever the blue pill is made up, which would put them into that dream world where we first met the Keanu Reeves character. It looked like a city. He was working in an office with a cubicle. He was going to clubs. He was doing all the things that he saw as a normal reality. But when he took that red pill, a red pill that many black people, many Native American people, many brown people have been taking since they've been living in this country and trying to explain to the obliviousness of white America, who still are on the blue pill, that we are seeing what's behind this thing that you call the American dream when it comes to our reality. We're seeing what Neo saw when he woke up from his sleep, okay? What was going on behind the scenes. We have to understand that truth So we're talking to an America where a majority of white America are still on the blue pill. They, they still think that this thing called racism is some distant thing that these people are either making up or, they have to explain to us, how wrong we are when we say Black Lives Matter. They have to explain what all lives matter. No, until we understand this truth, until you accept that we are seeing a reality that is our truth and listen to us, this thing called racism is going to continue. That's my point. It is a system created by white men in this country, a system that is dominated by white males, a small majority of rich white males that has been doing it. The founding fathers were the elite of that generation, okay? The poor farmer didn't have a say in what went into the Constitution. These were rich white landowners who created a system for them. It was the struggle of those who had an interest in it that reshaped and put themselves as part of the American dream, including people that look like us. The struggle still goes on for us. We got to understand that. We are talking from a red pill perspective. Many white Americans are still talking from a blue pill perspective. What you gonna do? That's my question. Think about it. Peace. Hotep. Bye-bye.